because I put myself out on Twitter, I went on a limb, and the limb got cut off, and people showed me. People convinced me that taking 120 grams an hour works. So now we published the paper, we've got this award, and now someone's telling me, but it's wrong, because now they're saying, no, these guys broke the world record, and they're taking 120 grams per hour, and you're telling us it doesn't work. You're stupid.
Yeah.
So I changed. Within 2 minutes, I said, I apologize. I've been wrong. These guys are right. They are taking a lot of carbohydrate. And the only way you can explain it is...
Professor Noakes, you and your colleagues recently published a paper titled Carbohydrate Ingestion on Exercise Metabolism and Physical Performance. This paper challenges something many runners and endurance athletes have believed for decades, that fatigue is primarily driven by a depletion of muscle glycogen, which is a body-stored form of carbohydrates. So to begin, can you briefly describe what your paper is about and the question you and your colleagues were trying to have answered?
Okay, so I've been in this field since 1976.
Okay, that was before I was born.
Both as an athlete and as a researcher. So my history goes back a long way. And I knew that carbohydrates work when you take them during exercise. They definitely work. And I'd found that when I didn't take it, my blood glucose level would fall and my performance would drop. And it could be dramatically reversed within minutes if you took the carbohydrate. And of course, that can't be an action on the muscles. It can't be that the muscles have suddenly stored more glycogen and you're going well, etc. So I knew that from my experience, but I learned everything and thought I knew it because I followed what everyone taught us. And I was a medical student in 1969. 1967, this famous paper comes out from Stockholm or Copenhagen, I think it was Stockholm, where they used a muscle biopsy technique to measure the glycogen in the muscle. And they found that if you ate lots of carbohydrate before exercise, you could exercise for much longer. They showed a graph, which I've shown hundreds of times, and I didn't see the problem because my mind was fixed. And the problem is the following, that this was a study of recreational physical education grade students. That's all.
Okay.
They weren't world-class athletes. And now you see that when we say we've got this evidence, people say, but it's not from world-class athletes, so it's irrelevant. Well, the most famous study, the most influential study in sports science was this muscle glycogen study, which was done on regular athletes who happen to be phys ed students. So please don't let the world tell me, but you can only study elite athletes. So now I'm a medical student, and we taught this in our physiology class, that muscle glycogen is so important because of this study. Now, the key graph that I'd shown hundreds of times was on the top, you have the performance of these people, how they do, and you'll see that their performance drops off very quickly if you haven't been eating much carbohydrate. Whereas if you've been on a carbohydrate diet, you can go on a lot longer. Then the second graph is what you're burning, the fuel you're burning, and it's either fat or carbohydrate. And it's clearly that the guys who are carbohydrate loaded burn much more carbohydrate, whereas the people who are carbohydrate depleted burn more fat. But then the bottom panel was the key one. And this showed the blood glucose concentration. Now, let me take you back that at the time that research was done in 1967, other Scandinavians in the 1930s in Copenhagen had shown that if your blood glucose falls during exercise, you become exhausted, you take more glucose, your blood glucose corrects, and you can go on for another period. And the theory in the 1930s was carbohydrates work by reversing a low blood glucose level, and they allow the brain to drive you ahead again, because the brain can't function without lots of glucose. So if the glucose is dropping, the brain anticipates a problem, and it says, I'm not going to kill myself by allowing the muscles to work. I'm going to stop recruiting the muscles, so you slow down. And that was what was taught from 1930 till 1967. And then along comes this paper, 1967, and the authors completely discount all the research that was done in the 1930s and the theory. And they don't disprove it. They don't try to disprove it. They just say, well, we prove it's glycogen. So I've been showing this for years. And then all of a sudden I looked at it, but I said, but hold on. These guys' blood glucose levels are getting very low. Whether they ate carbs or not before the exercise, their blood glucose levels are very low. And they all stop at low blood glucose levels, not at the same muscle glycogen levels. And so then I did an analysis, and it showed the only commonality in those studies was the blood glucose level at stopping when they stopped. There was little variation in it, but the muscle glycogen was much different between the guys who'd eaten lots of carbs and not. So they had not disproved that hypoglycemia was the problem. So I started looking then at the subsequent researchers, and I knew them very well because in 1986, there were two of us, or a couple of us, competing to show that carbohydrates could work during exercise. And our problem was we didn't starve the athletes before the exercise. Eddie Coyle from America, he made sure that the athletes went 16 hours faster before they did their test. And then he got them to exercise for 3 hours. And guess what? The blood glucose levels fell in the group that weren't taking carbohydrates, and they stopped exercising. Whereas if they were given carbohydrate, their blood glucose stayed high and they could continue. And then they did a whole lot of other studies. And they claimed that the carbohydrate was working in the muscles to make the muscles work better.
So these were athletes that were fasting for 16 hours. So assuming that their glycogen stores has been depleted from the muscles, and they're relying on
in the liver. That's the key. So these people started with low muscle glycogen content. Low liver glycogen content. And that was the key that was being forgotten. So I then spent 4 years writing the article, and my co-authors came along and helped. Later, they checked everything I'd written and made their own contributions. But it was for me, it was a 4-year project. And I discovered 16 different reasons why it's not muscle glycogen, but it's blood glucose that is limiting performance. And I presented that in the article. So in the end, we concluded a novel theory about metabolism that had never been discovered before. And the reason we could do it was because we had measured liver metabolism and muscle metabolism at the same time. And for 10 or 15 years, we've been working on this, hoping to show that carbohydrates improve performance. And we'd done every possible study you could think of to prove it, and we'd failed. But we didn't see it. What we were doing was we were feeding these people carbohydrate till it exploded. I mean, their blood glucose levels were up at 10 instead of 5. And we couldn't really show that the carbohydrate was acting in any particularly valuable way. What we did show was that the more carbohydrate that you took, the less fat you burned during exercise. And eventually it dawned on me that there are two pools of glucose in the body, the ones in the bloodstream and in the liver. And that has one function: to keep the blood glucose stable. It's not to make you a better runner and to set a world record. It's there to make sure your blood glucose stays stable. That's it. And it does that by dumping extra glucose into the muscles. The muscles are a store of excess glucose. And that is how you store. That's why you get lots of muscle glycogen when you load with carbohydrates. But you see, what we noticed was that if people are eating a high carbohydrate diet, they burn lots of carbohydrate when they're sleeping, when they're at rest. And we asked why. Why would you burn the jet fuel for exercise at rest? Doesn't make sense. You should be burning fat and sparing your limited carbohydrate stores for when you're racing. And you don't do that. And the more carbohydrates you ingest, the more carbohydrate you burn during the day. The only explanation is that your body wants to get rid of the glycogen, as quickly as possible.
Could that also be the insulin response? Because when insulin is secreted with carbohydrate ingestion, your adipose tissue is not exposed to being oxidized, regardless of its intensity, right?
You're absolutely correct. And I just laugh, when I see the scientists saying, no, the reason you can burn more fat is because you train. That's nonsense. If you stop eating carbohydrates, your rate of fat oxidation can triple in a few days. So that's very clearly shown. But what we showed is that muscle glycogen directs its own use. It determines how quickly the muscle glycogen is used. And it does that by influencing blood insulin concentrations. So if you eat a high carbohydrate diet and your muscle is full of carbohydrate, your insulin is elevated. And that's terribly important because now that can be a source for developing insulin resistance and diabetes. But it's always high until you exercise and get rid of the glycogen. So because your insulin is high, because the muscle glycogen is high, the muscles will burn the carbohydrate first. They will inhibit fat. One of the strongest regulators of fat metabolism is the blood insulin concentration. And it's profoundly powerful. At resting values, which very few humans reach, you're already inhibiting fat oxidation by muscle. So anyway, when we've done all this research, we clearly showed that there are two pools. They're totally differently regulated and they have different functions. And my opinion is that the muscle glycogen is there as a dump. It's where you dump the extra carbohydrate. And the moment you start exercising, the body says, thank goodness we can now get rid of this glycogen because this idiot eats such a high carbohydrate diet. He's going to expose us to more problems in trying to regulate our blood glucose level. So we better get rid of the glycogen quickly so that the next meal we can store the excess glucose. So, that's a radical departure from what we believe. And I don't want that to influence opinions. But what we've clearly shown, it's the blood glucose regulating performance and not muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen has essentially no influence on performance. So what you eat before exercise in terms of carbohydrates or fats does not influence your performance. You can eat a high carbohydrate diet or a low carbohydrate diet. Makes no difference. But during exercise, there comes a point when you need carbohydrates. Now, it's been really interesting the last week because I watched the Boston Marathon and it struck me that the guys weren't taking fluid as much as people were saying, and they weren't taking as much carbohydrate. That was my impression. And I raised the question, where's the evidence that these guys are taking 120 grams of carbohydrate every hour? And a lot of people got very, very angry. And they said, I'm now saying that you don't need any carbohydrates and athletes don't take carbohydrate, which I never said. But of course, what happens is when you discover something that's important, people don't like it, they're going to jump on you for anything. So anyway, eventually the companies that help these athletes showed what they were drinking, and they were drinking a lot of carbohydrate. They were drinking 120 grams an hour. There was no question they were doing it. And the answer they were doing it is because the solution is so concentrated. They don't have to drink much to get all that carbohydrate. That's why one is misled. I still don't think they're taking in as much as they claim, but that's not the point. They are drinking high carbohydrates regularly. And what it's doing, it's not acting physiologically, which is what we study. We study low carbohydrate content in drinks and low carbohydrate intakes, and that's physiology. Pharmacology is when you take in 120 grams an hour. That is a pharmacological dose. When we test people to see if they've got diabetes, we give them 65, 70 grams. And we think that's pharmacological dosing. Well, these guys are doing 120 grams for 2 hours consecutively. And at a pharmacological dose, that carbohydrate is acting differently. And it's acting in the brain to stimulate them and to reduce their fatigue. And the manufacturers of the product say it. This product is a fatigue buster. It's got caffeine in it, things as well. And they acknowledge it. And the athletes, I've seen now the athletes saying, we don't get as tired mentally as when we are not taking these doses. So now we can reconcile the whole story. And the story is you do need a little carbohydrate during exercise to prevent hypoglycemia. That's proven. We've proved it.
Could I just stop you there for a second? Could you just clarify hypoglycemia for someone that's listening that doesn't really know what that means?
Sure, apologies. So you've got the small glucose pool in the bloodstream and the liver, and that is one of the most protected functions in the human body because
Okay.
you can only survive with a blood glucose level that is tightly regulated between about 4 and 5. If it goes above 5, you could have diabetes, and all it takes is 1 extra gram. So normally you've got 5 grams in the bloodstream. If you've got 6 grams, you've got diabetes. That's all.
Okay.
1 extra gram, you got diabetes.
Six
One
grams
less
per
gram,
liter.
yeah, that's 6 grams per in the bloodstream, which is 5 liters.
Okay.
So it's six
Okay.
grams.
Okay.
So
Okay.
1 extra gram, and
You're
you've got
diabetic.
diabetes. 1 or 2 less, and you're dead because your brain's not functioning. So now that is
Okay.
the most tightly regulated phenomenon. And it's interesting because I was reading what happened when insulin was discovered. They were treating patients with diabetes who had no insulin. They would inject them, and their blood glucose would fall, and the symptoms they developed were extreme. So that your blood glucose moderation, if it's out of range, you get extreme symptoms. In
Okay.
athletes, what happens is if your blood glucose starts to fall below that 5, you start to feel weary, tired, you lose interest in continuing. And
You bonk.
yeah, that's it, right. And it's reversed very quickly if you just take a tiny amount of glucose, 25 grams, that's all. So that is the blood glucose is the regulator of your performance.
Okay.
But
Okay.
incidentally, there's no single thing that stops you exercising. It's a brain phenomenon, which has got nothing to do with all these other variables. Now, what's happened in physiologists, and I'm one of them, and I'm at fault, is we want to get you in the laboratory and measure one thing that is the solution to everything. So we taught muscle glycogen. That's the key to fatigue. It's almost got nothing to do with it. Fatigue is a very, very complex phenomenon. And ultimately, you choose to stop exercising. You choose, your brain chooses. And it's long before you get into trouble and you run out of glycogen or whatever. Those
Okay.
aren't the fatigue. The fatigue is a much more complex phenomenon.
Just so I understand you correctly, we have the muscle glycogen, which is a big pool of glycogen in our body, and then we have the liver and the blood glucose, which is a smaller pool of another form of carbohydrates, right? And you're saying that muscle glycogen has no relation to how we perform, but it's the regulation of the blood glucose and the liver together that regulates how well we perform. Now that we have both pools, when someone is exercising, racing, training, is the muscle still pulling glycogen from the muscles and glucose from the bloodstream at the same time to produce force and power?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
when you start exercising, what the muscle glycogen content will determine what you use, the fuel that you use during exercise. And that's completely
Okay.
hidden. No one tells you
Okay.
that. So the more carbohydrates you eat, the more carbohydrates you're going to burn during exercise. Because we've always been told, well, you must spare glycogen. Well, the only way you can spare glycogen is to start exercise with low glycogen. That's the only way you can do it.
Okay.
So you can see the conflict now. We can't tell people to start with low glycogen if we want to spare
Yeah.
glycogen. That doesn't make sense because we believe that the low glycogen is going to cause you to stop exercising. So people don't go down that route to discuss it that way. So you're quite right. So now I'm rewriting Law of Running, the book. And for the first time, I've shown what influences muscle glycogen use. And I've shown what happens when you fast or when you eat a low carbohydrate diet. You simply burn bundles of fat. And it doesn't
Okay.
matter what exercise intensity you do, you can go up to 85% of your maximum. You will burn fat at very high rates, which also, you're not allowed to say that in sports science because that also conflicts with what's believed. So if you start with a low glycogen, you will burn fat, and there's plenty of fat in the body, and the body can use fat very effectively, and that's how humans evolved. We didn't evolve as carbohydrate burners. We evolved as fat burners, and all activity was done on fat. But if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, you do the opposite. Now, what we've shown is that it doesn't matter what you start the exercise with, your performance is going to be the same. And just for everyone's interest, one of the key proponents of the opposite idea that you must have a high carbohydrate diet is Professor Louise Burke, who I really like, and we have lots of good things going together. But I completely
Out of
disagree with her.
Australia.
Yeah, I completely disagree with her. And we've had this lovely debate in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And it's coming out this Monday on May the 1st, this Friday on May the 1st. Sorry, obviously, we're a few days before May the 1st. By the time we show this, it'll be more beyond that.
It will be after. Yeah. That's tomorrow.
But on May the 1st, please go to the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and you'll see the article. And we have this great debate and we argue both sides of the argument and people can judge. You can judge, you can look at all the evidence. And she is absolutely convinced that if you're an elite athlete, muscle glycogen is terribly, terribly important. And I'm equally convinced that it's got no role. And so we've got these two opposing opinions. And we both put forward our best case. So it's for people to read them and decide what they think. But in my opinion, which I'm obviously biased to my opinion, there have been countless studies. There have been countless studies, even including one where guys ran 50 kilometers on a treadmill and they could find no difference. And we have done studies from 800 meter repetitions, 1 mile, up to exercise lasting more than 2 hours. We find no difference between performance. But you add the glucose to prevent hypoglycemia, and performance improves 20%. Now, even if a high carbohydrate diet works, it will never make a 20% improvement. It's a 1 or 2% difference. So we've got this tiny effect of pre-exercise diet versus huge effect of what you do during exercise.
So from your point of view, is it correct for me to think that if muscle glycogen stores are low, and we start exercising, racing, training with low muscle glycogen stores, we are telling or prompting our bodies to oxidize a higher percentage of fat from the gate. But in order to fuel our exercise, our training, we consume carbohydrates during the exercise to make sure that the performance increase. So basically, it's kind of, the muscle glycogen is kind of like a switch. If we have glycogen in the muscles, the body switches to burning a higher amount of carbohydrates. I say carbohydrates, but it might be glucose or glycogen. But if that has low glycogen, we switch to burning fat, but we are introducing glucose during the training to boost performance. Am I in line with what you're saying?
Spot on. That's brilliant. So now the only thing you need to add to that is something I also learned as we wrote this paper. And I'd never seen it, although our own data showed it. So our own data from 20 years before showed it, but we ignored it because it didn't fit the model. We're trying to show that carbohydrates everything. So what happens is that your muscle glycogen use drops during exercise. As the muscle has less glycogen, the insulin drops and your fat oxidation rises. So that's standard physiology, easy to understand. What isn't easy to understand is that the glucose in the small glucose pool in the bloodstream continues to increase during exercise. The use of it continues to increase. So you've got muscle glycogen using less and less carbohydrate, but from the blood itself, more carbohydrate is going, more glucose is going out. And
that's regulated by the liver.
Yeah, that's coming from the liver. Now, the problem is that the liver, if it's not properly trained, will struggle to keep up. And eventually it can't keep up. And when it can't keep up in producing glucose that the muscles and the brain are demanding, that's when you become hypoglycemic. So you will, every athlete, unless they are exceptionally fat adapted, will develop hypoglycemia if they don't take carbohydrates during exercise. And that's where we came in the 1900s, because no one was taking carbohydrates during marathons. And then all of a sudden they were given carbohydrates and they did much better. So that was the beginning. We knew that carbohydrates worked, but we didn't understand exactly how they worked and why they worked. And I can go back another second. The first major conference I went to, 1976, the New York Academy of Sciences conference of the marathon. A guy called John Warren spoke, and he was like the god of metabolism. And he showed a slide that in people exercising for 70 minutes, blood glucose falls. And it was because the muscle was taking up too much glucose. And he said, there you are. It's a beautiful graph, beautiful slide. And so that influenced me, because in 1976, John Warren, the guru of metabolism, says hypoglycemia is inevitable during prolonged exercise. So, and then I said, I want to study that. And so we did study it. And then we came to the conclusion that the body has got this major flaw, that it continues to burn glucose at high rates from the blood when the liver is becoming depleted. And the solution to that is to get the liver to convert fat into glucose, or lactate or other things into glucose. And you can do that with,
Okay. Can I just go back a little bit to the statement I made about muscle glycogen being low and we are ingesting carbohydrates when we are training and racing to improve our performance? So I know your paper talks about a pretty low amount of carbohydrates that is needed to improve performance. But if someone wants to optimize that with low muscle glycogen, would they be optimizing performance by consuming a higher amount of carbohydrates when they are training and racing? Like we talked about the 120 grams just now. Does that actually reduce fatigue and improve performance above 10, 20, 30 grams of carbohydrates during exercise?
That's a brilliant, brilliant question. And if you'd asked me that a week ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer it. But because I put myself...
My timing is fantastic.
So because I put myself out on Twitter, I went on a limb, and the limb got cut off. And people showed me. People convinced me that taking 120 grams an hour works. They absolutely convinced me. So you read the paper. I'm not sure if you're aware of the other paper that we published last year, which was recently selected as the best impact paper in American Journal of Physiology, Cell Physiology.
Okay.
The best impact paper. And this is the one that shows the small and large glucose pools. Now, it's very seldom that sports science gets this sort of award. We're competing with all the experts on cancer and all sorts of other exciting things. To have a humble paper which talks about carbohydrates and exercise to win that award is astonishing. But that's because people realize what we found is absolutely revolutionary. And it's a complete paradigm shift. So now, we published the paper, we've got this award, and now someone's telling me, but it's wrong. They're telling me it's wrong. So you understand that? Because now they're saying, no. These guys broke the world record in the marathon, in the London Marathon. And they're taking 120 grams per hour, and you're telling us it doesn't work. You're stupid. And they've been telling me this for the last 3 or 4 years. Oh, Noakes, you don't know what's happening out there in the real world. The Tour de France cyclists, they swear by 120 grams an hour. And look how well they're performing. And the marathon runners, etc., and the triathletes as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm getting bombarded with this, but I'm saying, but hold on, in the laboratory, we can't show that effect. And we know it can't be true. We know it can't be true, okay? Because the small glucose pool doesn't need 120 grams an hour to maximize performance. So there I am, and I've now got the opportunity to see that actually these guys are doing it and it's working. So originally I said, they're actually not doing it. They're cheating, not cheating. What they're doing is not what the companies are telling us.
In terms of grams of carbohydrates.
Yeah,
per hour.
That's right.
Okay.
And then the company actually published the exact drinking patterns of these runners, of Siwa, of Sebastian Siwa, and also Joma Kajecha. They said this is what these guys have done, and they also said that they had traveled to Kenya to help Siwa learn how to drink so much carbohydrate. They had coached him on 6 different trips all the way to Kenya. So why would they go to Kenya if it didn't work? Okay, so now then I had the opportunity to say they're wrong, disagree with them, we know the science, our paper's just got this major award and it's been recognized. How can you guys tell me it's wrong? So now my great friend Paul Larson, who is a low-carb athlete, and he promotes a low-carbohydrate diet, and he's helping me co-author the training side of Law of Running. He sent an email. Yeah. He sends an email to me and he says, Tim, I think I've solved the problem. What's happening
Okay.
is that glucose is acting in the brain as a drug, as a stimulant
Okay.
at these doses. And then he gives me a whole explanation. In fact, he writes a whole paper on it. You see, there's the paper. And he says he's going to write this up as a publication. And he
Okay.
explains where the evidence is that it's acting as a central stimulant and is busting fatigue. And he gives a whole
Okay.
reasoning. And so I said, Paul, I trust you absolutely implicitly. You're going to be right. I'm going to change my opinion. So I changed within 2 minutes. I said, I apologize. I've been wrong. These guys are right. They are taking a lot of carbohydrate. And the only way you can explain it is they trained themselves, the brain's adapted to it, and the brain's expecting it, it's getting a nice stimulation. We can't recreate that in the laboratory because we use much lower carbohydrate doses. And I think the key is that the drink is so concentrated. And so what they have to train their bodies is to cope with this enormously concentrated drink because the gut
Yeah.
rejects it, absolutely
Correct.
rejects it. So according to the old model is, now what's happening is they're training the gut to absorb the glucose and then the muscle is using it. It's not happening. That's not what the thing is. They're getting to adapt to the bad influences, which doesn't affect them anymore. And they've got only the good influence, and the good influence is the stimulation of the brain. So
Okay.
that's how it's working. And the scientists have been working on it vigorously, and they're just going the wrong way. It's not a fuel. It's not acting as a fuel. It's acting as a stimulant. That's the
Okay.
key. So now
Okay.
I'm very happy to say I was totally wrong. And if you want to run a sub 2 hour marathon, or you want to be Tour de France cyclist, or you want to win the the Ironman, you need that high dose to keep stimulating you, keep you stimulating for all those hours. Particularly if you do an Ironman in 7 or 8 hours, you can get pretty bored out there, I would think. I've done some, so I won't say
Yeah.
no. It
Okay.
can get
Okay.
boring on the bike if you're trundling along.
Yeah.
so, so that I think is the answer.
Okay.
So to get
So
back to your question, your question, you only need 10 to 20 grams an hour to maximize your metabolism,
okay.
but to maximize your performance through the brain effect, you need to stimulate through the mouth and the upper gut. There must be receptors there which tell the brain there's a lot of glucose coming in and it's acting as a drug-like stimulant, which
Okay.
of
Okay.
course is
So
legal. When I say
yeah,
the
yeah,
word
yeah,
drug,
yeah,
it's all legal.
yeah.
So I'm not trying
Okay.
to tell you
Yeah.
that they're cheating. They're not.
Yeah, not erythropoietin. We're talking about carbohydrates here. Okay, so let me see if I understand you correctly. So right now, you are of the opinion that with low or high muscle glycogen, that's completely irrelevant. What's most relevant is during training, racing, and exercise, we increase the amount of carbohydrates that we are consuming during the effort to, if we can go to 120 grams, if our gut allows it, that's what's really optimizing performance. But 10 grams is the minimum that's needed to improve performance with zero, well, so-called zero muscle glycogen. Am I correct to say that?
So the answer is on the metabolic side, you
Mm-hmm.
don't fuel the muscles, you fuel the brain. And that just
Okay.
takes 10 to 20 grams an hour. That's the
Okay.
fueling. Okay. But
Okay.
if you want to stimulate the brain, then you've got to take 120 grams an hour. And that's the
Okay.
difference.
Okay. 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 So for someone, I'm just thinking of someone that is at my age, right? Late 40s, 50s, maybe trying to get rid of a bit of excess body fat using running as a means of doing that. If they were to start their runs in the morning in a fasted state, muscle glycogen levels are very low. They go out for their run, but they're consuming carbohydrates, be it 10 grams per hour or 50 grams per hour. They are actually upregulating their body's ability to oxidize fat despite consuming the carbohydrates during their training, during their run. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. But the key again, you only need your 20 grams. That's all you need an hour.
Okay.
And that
Okay.
won't cause insulin spiking and inhibition of fat oxidation. And
Because of the
so
group 4
you,
transporter.
Yeah. So what people are not told that the moment you take carbohydrates, you reduce your fat oxidation. So if you want to maximize fat oxidation, you want to train fasted and just ingest a little bit of carbohydrate and eat a low
Okay.
carbohydrate diet. That's the way you adapt the body to burning fat.
Okay. So you're now saying that not a high carbohydrate diet, as in our daily consumption, but high carbohydrates during training and racing is the key to performance.
I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
I,
Okay.
I, so I'm okay. So I'm very biased because I watch marathons, and I'm just as interested in the guy who finishes last as the guy who finishes first.
Okay.
And what I see with the guy finishing last, he's usually obese. He's got visceral obesity, and he's told to eat 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour, and that is toxic. That's a killer
For him.
for him. That's a killer. So that's my problem. That we
Yeah.
need to put carbohydrates in their perspective. If you are a just wanting to run and complete the event, your 20 grams an hour is all you need. That's it. And a low carbohydrate diet is going to be more beneficial because you're going to be at less risk of developing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So that's my main complaint about this pressure to take carbohydrates is
Yeah.
that is that we're pushing it on people who can't metabolize the carbohydrate and for whom it is very toxic.
Yeah, I love what you just said. I mean, different strokes for different folks, right? So the guy trying to run a 6 hour marathon that is overweight and trying to complete the marathon is not going to benefit from 120 grams of carbs per hour because he has a different substrate that he needs to use. But then the guy that's trying to run a 2 hour marathon, or even an amateur like myself trying to run a sub 3 hour marathon, we can utilize carbs to help us improve performance. So it really depends on the goal of the athlete, where they are in their stage of training and their progress, that they should utilize different fueling and diet strategies. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And the key is whether you're
Okay.
insulin resistant or not, because if you're insulin resistant like me and you eat carbohydrates like without control, you will develop type 2 diabetes. But it's not going to hit you. It's going to hit you at 55, 60. And that's the problem. And it was not necessary. That extra carbohydrate you ate at night and eating that high carbohydrate didn't help you in any sense. And
Yeah.
all it did was cause you to get type 2 diabetes.
Let's take it through the lens of someone that is, well, an age group athlete that is chasing maybe a podium position or a PR, be it a marathon or an ultra. So we talked about the liver and the blood glucose as well as the muscle glycogen. So if the liver and the blood, if the liver is the main regulator of the blood glucose, is there any point in carb loading the liver? So, we think of carb loading, the traditional way of eating pasta, eating potatoes, rice. These are generally converted to glucose, which go into the bloodstream and then they go straight to the muscles to be stored as glycogen through the SGLT1 transporter, right? But in the liver, for example, through fructose intake that is transported by the GLUT5 transporter, would doing that load for the liver before a big race help with performance?
Only if you're going to not take carbohydrate during exercise. I think that's the
Oh,
answer.
okay.
Because you
Okay.
can
Okay.
so easily maintain your blood glucose. But you're quite right. The liver contains about 100 grams of carbohydrate. And if you take a carbohydrate load, it's going to get filled. So when you start the race, it's always going to have its 100 grams in if you've been eating carbohydrate. If you've been carbohydrate loading, we don't know whether you're going to get 200 grams or more.
Mm,
But because people haven't actually done those studies or they haven't
okay.
done them in the past, they might be doing them now. But again, I say it's irrelevant because if you're taking your 10 to 20 grams during exercise, what your starting liver glycogen was is immaterial because you're protecting it anyway.
Okay. And going back a bit to to the paper where you talked, or you mentioned just now that you tested athletes that were running 800 meters repeats all the way up to 50 kilometers at this 10, 20 grams per hour with low muscle glycogen. So am I right to say that regardless of intensity, maintaining blood glucose or topping up carbohydrates into the blood glucose during training works?
I'm just make the point that we didn't have people taking carbohydrate during all those events. In many of
Okay.
them, like the 800 meters, you've got so much glucose
Yeah,
you don't
yeah.
need anymore. The
Of course, of
the
course, yeah.
final trial we did was using 10 grams. And by the way, we
Okay,
chose it because we specifically wanted to show that you can improve performance without influencing muscle metabolism. That was the key. We were feeding the brain, and the brain said, "Thank you very much," and it allowed the athletes to perform better.
okay,
So,
okay,
so you really only need carbohydrates when you're going more than 2 hours. Then that's when you almost all people will require carbohydrates. Some might need it after an hour, but most people will only need it after 2 hours. Then it will definitely have an effect. So
okay.
the other thing in that paper, I went and looked. I was the first person to ask this question. What happened to the blood glucose concentrations in the control experiment? So now, because you've got your intervention experiment, and everyone looks at the glucose in the intervention trial, but although they record it, they don't notice that the blood glucose is falling in the control group. And almost always you find that if carbohydrates work, in other words, if the study reports carbohydrates improve performance, all you have to do is look at the control group. And the control group, almost always their blood glucose levels fall. But the scientists won't say, oh, you see, it prevented hypoglycemia. They'll say, oh, it was used by the muscles to burn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because no one thinks glucose is important in the bloodstream. But once you look for it, that's what we found. So that's all I do now is as soon as a paper is published and it says carbohydrates or some other intervention improved performance, I look at what happened to the glucose, not in the experimental group, because it's always going to be high in the experimental group who take carbohydrate. You want to look at what happens to the control group. And if the glucose stays normal in the control group, generally the intervention won't work. It'll only work if the blood glucose falls in the control group. And to maximize that, you fast them for 16 hours, so the liver glycogen is depleted, and then you have them exercise for 2 to 3 hours. And you will always find an effect of carbohydrates. And that's where we missed out. And where Eddie Coyle did that, and he showed an effect of carbohydrates. We didn't do it, and we couldn't find an effect. We didn't fast the guys to lower the blood glucose level or the liver glycogen level, to deplete the small glucose pool before exercise.
Let's try and take this everything that we've said up to now down to a more practical level for someone that wants to utilize this strategy, right? We talked a bit earlier about someone the last finisher of a marathon that is overweight should take a different approach than elite athletes. So, what would your recommendation be for a recreational masters athlete to interpret all this information? How should they make use of this that we've talked about to relate it to their situation to define the correct strategy for them?
Okay, you go to your physician and you have your blood glucose level measured in the morning, and you have your
Okay.
fasting insulin measured. And
Okay.
then you can also have your HbA1c, glycated hemoglobin level measured. And if any of those markers are elevated, you are on the road to diabetes. And
Okay.
all your exercise isn't going to stop it. Like me, you will develop diabetes if you stick with that bad diet. So only if you're cleared on that, and the doctor says, no, you've got no insulin resistance. By the way, you have to find a physician who understands insulin resistance.
Okay.
So, so that's what you'll need. So now, if you've got clearance from the doctor, you've got no insulin resistance. The other thing he could do was check what your liver looks like. Is your liver full of fat? Have you got visceral
Okay.
obesity? And that would be very helpful. And so
Okay.
once he's done that and given you clarification that you haven't got any of that, then you can continue to eat your high carbohydrate diet. But if
Okay.
not, if any of those markers are wrong, my advice is you reduce your carbohydrate intake and you start training on a low carbohydrate diet.
And you use that 10 grams, 15 grams per hour during
Absolutely.
the training to stabilize your blood glucose so you don't go into hypoglycemia.
But only if you're going to run more than an hour or two. If you're
Got it.
not
Yeah.
running an
Yeah.
hour or two, you don't need it.
But even for somebody that is metabolically flexible, doesn't have insulin resistance, do you think that that is a benefit to periodizing carbohydrates? So, for example, if in the off season where they're not racing and they're just doing some base training, to take a lower carb strategy and take a higher carb strategy when they're in the peak of their training, before a marathon or an ultra, whichever they're training for?
Okay, so what you have to understand is what's your model, the model that of performance. My model says carbohydrates make no difference.
Okay.
So whether you start with lots of muscle glycogen or low muscle glycogen is not
Oh, sorry.
material.
I meant the carbohydrates during training. So, like in your off season, you're taking less carbohydrates during the training itself, but ramping it up when you're actually trying to optimize performance during the season. If you're training for a marathon.
To answer that question, we have to ask, well, what's your model of performance? And the
Okay.
model you are suggesting, I know you don't necessarily believe it, but the model you're suggesting is muscle glycogen is important. And I don't think it's important. So it doesn't
Okay.
matter what you eat, whether you have a high or low carbohydrate diet.
You talked about an athlete being highly fat adapted. If someone wants to try and achieve the balance of being highly fat adapted but still wanting to optimize their performance, and we're talking about somebody that is lean, maybe chasing a 3 hour marathon, how would it balance that so that they are fat adapted but at the same time utilizing the stimulant of carbohydrates to perform?
So, I mean, you can hear my bias. My bias is a low carbohydrate diet is much healthier than eating the
Okay.
rubbish that many athletes ingest because, I'm a marathon runner. I need all these carbs. And so what do they eat? They eat sugar, they eat ultra processed foods, and they've got a sugar addiction. And that's the big problem. When we try to tell people that their carbohydrate diet's wrong, many of them say, but there's no way I can stop eating my sweets and sugar and so on, because that's the addiction. I like people who are not sugar addicted to work with them. So that would be the first thing. So I see no benefit in eating more than 100 grams of carbohydrate a day. It might be safe for these people to eat 200 grams, but I don't see any benefit to them for eating that amount. So that's my bias.
Okay.
And I can't get away from that bias because there is no evidence that training on a high carbohydrate diet is more beneficial than training on a low carbohydrate diet. There's no evidence that racing on a high carbohydrate diet is more beneficial than racing on a high fat diet. The evidence is simply not there. That's my opinion, expressed in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, having looked at 100 years of scientific evidence.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
I come back to the point that I believe science is important. And if the
Yeah.
studies are done properly and you look at all the evidence, that's what you have to conclude. I must say another thing. In science, it becomes obvious whether something works or not. And
Mhm.
we've been trying these carbohydrate loading diets to improve performance. And how long have they been around? They've been around for 50 years or so. And that no one has come up and no one, including the industry, has done the definitive study to prove that these things work. But yet you go to the websites and they say, we study performance. Well, that's interesting because you never publish the results of the studies that we would like you to do.
Yeah.
All they study is that their scientists do, and their scientists cannot risk doing any study that might prove you actually don't need all that carbs.
Okay.
That's the
Yeah.
key. I looked when I was looking at these guys running this ultra marathon, the world records, and I looked at who's funding the scientists who are telling us that you must eat that. Well, it turns out it's the industry is funding the scientists who are telling the athletes they must ingest high rates of carbohydrate intake. So they are correct, accept that, they're correct, but the message is coming from the industry, not from the scientists. That's the key. And if you're skeptical like I am, and I'm an African, and I have great respect for the East African runners, and I have great respect for everything they've achieved. And why do they achieve it? They achieve it because of who they are, not because they suddenly increased their carbohydrate intake or they wore a Western shoe.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
can't stand colonialism.
Mhm.
And it's the colonial influence again. Oh, you see, they beat the world record because they used colonial knowledge. They didn't. They used their African knowledge that they had worked out themselves with their coaches and their other brilliant athletes. And a beautiful statement that, Kenyan athletes in Ethiopia are not genetically advantaged, they are culturally advantaged. And that's the key.
Yeah.
It's the culture that they grow in, and that's what makes them such great runners. The stimulation might mean they run 30 seconds faster or a minute faster, and the shoes might mean they run a minute faster. But to run 2:03 marathon, that's something special without any of these things. That's the African contribution.
Yeah.
The
Well,
the
yeah.
Western influence is minuscule. And what do we see? The media exposes the Western influence, and the African influence is written out of the history. And that's disgraceful for these athletes, because they get up every morning at 5 o'clock. They've been doing it since they were 10 or 11 years old. And
Yeah.
that's why they are so successful.
Well, the carbohydrate diet that you recently described a short while ago, you were talking mainly about ultra processed carbohydrates, sugars, candy. But if you look at the East Africans, the Kenyans, their diet is also predominantly carbohydrates, but they are eating whole food carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates. So if we were to split this two, right, you have a bias against processed or ultra processed carbohydrates, and I me too. All right. I guess anyone with a right frame of mind would be anti ultra processed carbohydrates. But the spectrum of carbohydrates is pretty large. You have your complex carbohydrates, which are your beans, your legumes, your whole grains and all that. What's your view of someone consuming those kind of carbohydrates as part of their diet?
Yeah, so the Kenyans live on ugali and the
Yeah.
Ethiopians on teff. That's what they eat. They're both high carbohydrates. The Ethiopians actually used to eat more meat, and some of their great athletes in the past ate much more meat than they do now. So absolutely, you're quite correct. The Kenyans eat a high carbohydrate diet, but you didn't ask why. No one asks why. And the answer is these people live in dire poverty
Yeah.
in pastoral environments. That's where they come from. And so, and it's the poverty that drives them to be successful. The poverty also determines what they eat. And now what we're trying to distinguish between is it the poverty and the hard living that they have to go through, or is it the diet? Because they're both interlinked, they're both related. And that's the question. And in my interpretation, it's the very difficult life that these people have. I mean, I've been writing their histories for Law of Running, and most of them, it says he was raised in dire poverty, and this is the one way out is running, and they must eat ugali because maize is the main food. I've been there. I've been to Eton. I've been to one of the training centers for the runners, and they showed me the food. It was astonishing. No, you can't survive on that diet, but they do.
Okay.
Sorry. So to answer your question, I still think you need to eat a low carbohydrate diet of all the foods that you suggested, and avoid all ultra processed foods.
Okay. Can we talk a bit about your central governor theory? Based on that theory, the fatigue isn't purely muscular, but is neurological, where the brain becomes the controlling organ, right? So why would the brain shut down the body before the muscles actually fail? What's the mechanism behind that?
Okay, so now the central governor model has been updated very much so through
Okay.
work of,
Okay.
and the error with it, and this is a very good complaint about the central governor. We said that it limits you. It always limits you. So people said, but hold on, that's not how the body works. You must be able to increase your performance. And that is true. And so emotion and intellect come in, and there's a whole other component that we ignored. So we said it's purely physiology that's driving it. And it's not. Psychology is critically important as well. And so that's the emotion and the intellect come in, and it's all a combination. But other models focus more on, well, I'm just reading this book because this book, How Bad Do
Oh,
You Want It, by Matt
I love the
Fitzgerald.
book, Matt Fitzgerald.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So he talks about Sam McCora's model, and Sam
Yes.
quite rightly said, but Noakes' model can't be right because it excludes emotion and thought and the conscious desire. But his model fails. It doesn't fail. It says it's all motivation, but you can't measure motivation. There's no measure for motivation. So as I understand it, he's absolutely correct in what he's criticized it, but we've come up with Andreas Venhorst and now more recently some other guys have come up with a much better model. And I can't show you, I don't have it right at hand, but in which the brain anticipates. Firstly, you start with anticipation, you go along fine, but then it becomes this battle because you've got this discomfort. And they call that perceived fatigability. And you can fight that through emotional, as long as you act positive, etc., and your intellect, which you've been working on, and you've been through this experience. You've trained, you've run 30, 35 Ks in training, and you know what the brain's going to do to you. So you've learned how to cope with that. And that then becomes the key determinant. So there's no question that the brain ultimately determines your performance. But the paradox is that it's the muscles telling the brain, I've had enough, that you stop. So the muscles do actually eventually say, that's enough, I've had enough. And your brain accepts it. Your intellect and your emotion says, okay, that's enough. And then you fall off the pace and then you quit. And that sequence. Okay. So what we recreated in the laboratory, Andreas Venhorst, and this is published in good journals. He had people compete against each other. They were equal athletes, and then they would race each other on bicycles, and you could see who was leading. The moment the one guy got ahead, the other guy quit, or he would start to quit, and everything would go wrong. His, what we call valence, his emotions would get negative, and he'd go through an impending action crisis. And the action crisis is where it's all at. Because the action crisis is, here's what your goal is, but the effort's too much to keep that goal. And so you fight this. I still want to run the sub 2-hour marathon, but it's so sore. I don't know if I can do it. And then eventually you quit. And that's what the battle really is. And so is it but it's because this fatigue is developing and the fatigue is causing all these symptoms, and you generate the symptoms yourself. They're unique to yourself. So you've got these rising symptoms which you are generating, and then you've got this, I must keep going, and then something gives, and that's the action crisis. And that's what we call hitting the wall. And it's not glycogen, it's this battle in your emotions and your intellect. And that's where the battle is really fought. It's not fought directly in the muscles, but ultimately the muscles win because you slow down.
So the brain controls it, but it takes the feedback from the muscles and all the other systems that are working, whether it's your hydrogen ions that are rising, that is coupled with lactate, the soreness of your muscles, all that feedback is taken in by the brain, and it decides to slow down, or the risk of pushing it kind of mitigates that.
That's correct. Right? And that's why.
Okay.
So one of the Sam McCora's, I'm very glad he criticized us because we were wrong. But he thinks you can train the brain by sitting in front of a computer and getting yourself tired. And if you make the brain tired, that will make you better. And Alex Hutchison wrote in his book, Endure, he went through that training program for his marathon. He was doing fantastically with up to 32 Ks, and then suddenly he hit the wall and it made no difference because this was the battle. And no one's told us, how do you balance that? When the crunch comes, how do you win the battle and say, I still want to achieve my goal. I don't care how much pain I'm feeling. I want to win to achieve that goal. No one tells us how you train that. No psychologist I'm aware of has shown you how you train that. But the athletes know. They know how to do it, and the great coaches know how to do it. And they do it every day. They push you so that you will last for longer before this crisis happens. And that's partly the physiology. It's partly a result of the physiological changes, but it's hugely an effect of the way you control your emotions and your intellect during the race.
As we start to land the plane, based on your experience, what mistakes do you think people are most likely to make after hearing this conversation that we just have had regarding carbohydrates?
to continue to think carbohydrates are everything. That's right.
Okay.
That's the error, and it's safe and effective, and you can do what you like. That's the danger. Don't be like me and think that, and then you get diabetes, and then you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't be here. And what we are noticing is more and more people in their 30s and 40s, recreational athletes, who are coming to us with prediabetes, and they can't understand it. I'm a runner. I'm lean. How can I possibly have this? And in one of our studies, 3 of 10 were pre-diabetic, and they completely reversed it on the high-fat diet that was part of the program. They were completely normal. You couldn't detect anything wrong. But on the high carbohydrate part of the diet, they were clearly pre-diabetic. And, I've seen some of the glucose curves, and this is one of the problems. Some of the glucose curves in people taking 120 grams an hour, the small glucose pool just cannot cope, and it quits, and the blood glucose shoots up into levels that are not healthy. We did some experiments years ago where we infused glucose into the veins in the arm at high dose. So we got the values up to 10 millimoles per liter. And that was part of the studies where we showed you can't stop muscle glycogen use. It'll just do what it has to do. And the guys came back the next day and said, Prof, look at my arm. It's all red and swollen and irritated. And that 10 millimoles had irritated the veins, the lining of the veins, and they'd become inflamed. And they could see it on the skin. The vein was sticking out. Now, if it's doing that to the veins, what's it doing to the arteries? And that's when you get your glucose up to 10. And these guys are running with values between 6 and 8 during these events, these marathons, ultramarathons, Ironman. If you're taking in 120 grams of carbs, your glucose is going to be above 7 the whole time. And that's a diabetic. That is diagnosis of diabetes, is a glucose above 7. You can cope for, if it's only up for 2 hours or 3 hours. But if you're doing that day in, day out, years on end, it's going to have an effect.
Okay. If you had one final practical takeaway for someone who wants to get faster, but also stay healthy for the next 20 to 40 years, what would it be?
Follow the Norwegian method of training. Okay. So the Norwegian method is that you don't do gray zone training. You do either very low intensity or quite high intensity.
Polarized.
It's very polarized. And the problem is most runners, myself in my career, we ran in that gray zone. And what Marius Bakken has done in writing the book and sorting out the Norwegian method, he did it. Let me just go back. Arthur Lydiard developed the Lydiard training program on himself. He tested himself. He ran 250 miles a week. He ran 50 miles a week, and he discovered there's something magical once you get to about 100, even if you're a track athlete. By the way, Jonas Kajelcha, I'm sure I didn't get his name rightly, but he's the guy who came second. I mean, what an athlete. This guy has run indoor mile in 3:49. I mean, and his performances are astonishing. He's a 3:49 indoor miler.
Yeah.
And his performances are astonishing. So sorry, I'm getting back to my point. Marius Bakken did exactly the same. He ran twice in the Olympics. He came 7th in the Olympics, but that was the best he could do. He was your excellent athlete who wasn't quite the world's best. And he spent his life working out what was the training zone he wanted to train in. And he tested his blood lactate levels with 5,000 tests. And he concluded that most of the running is done at a speed that is too fast. And he's developed this theory that the muscle is also a governor. And he hasn't come out to it. He only spoke to us about this sort of privately. And he learned that your muscle tone rises as you get tired. When recovery, if you did too much training, your muscles have more tone. And that's why they feel heavy and sore. And when he looked at the muscle tone, it was increased. But when you do training properly, you don't get this increase in muscle tone. And that's the key, because you recover much more quicker. And so his whole hypothesis was, I want to do the right amount of training that I can get the most volume. And he felt 180 kilometers a week is about the right. He wants to do his 180 kilometers a week, but he wants to be able to also do intensive training, but not too much. And he discovered that the key is how much the low intensity training you're doing. It's got to be really low. Okay. And it was interesting, John Career, who won the Boston Marathon, someone showed his Garmin, he was running at 9 minutes a mile in training. Okay. People said, how can that guy win the marathon? And the other thing is that it's clear that when you start running at a young age, you must do volume. That's the key. It's not the intensity. You must do the volume. And the best athletes that are coming out of Norway are trained on that approach. And Norway is an astonishing country because they probably produce the most great athletes for the number of people in the country, and they totally dominate the Winter Olympics cross-country skiing. So the guy
triathlon as well.
Yeah, Klæbo won 6 Olympic gold medals in the skiing, from 1.5 kilometers, which took him 3 minutes, to the 50K, which took him 2.5 hours. So here's a guy who dominates the world. Everyone will be focusing. Some people will be experts in 1.5Ks. He beat all of them.
Correct.
Some will be experts in 50 kilometers. He beat all of them. And he was so average as a child, they didn't think he'd ever do anything. And then suddenly he just converted and became a brilliant athlete. But he was never pushed as a youngster.
Oh, we see that in Norwegian triathlon as well, like Christian Blumenfeld, who has won the Olympic gold medal, which is a short course triathlon. And he's also Ironman world champion, which is a long course triathlon, and half Ironman world champion. So yeah, the range is amazing for this model.
Blumenfeld, a few weeks ago, he won the Dallas Ironman.
Yeah.
It takes an Ironman. And I think he'd done an Ironman a few weeks before. I mean, unbelievable. They're breaking all the rules, and the training volume that he does is off the charts now. But it's done appropriately with lots of low intensity training.
Yeah. Well, my closing question for you, Professor Tim Noakes, is what does endurance mean to you?
What is endurance? I've never been asked that question. Are you asking about sport or life? Probably let's talk about life. I think it's
whichever way you want to interpret it. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, it's to keep going. I mean that's how you describe it, and its ability to have the mental control that allows you to keep pushing, regardless of the obstacles that you face, and that then can go for either sport or for the work that you do. I think one of my features of my life is I've probably been one of the most criticized people. I've had to endure that, including my trial where I was
I read the book.
Health Professions Council. I mean, that was really tough. That really required endurance. Yeah. But I think that having run the Comrades Marathon, that to me, and you reach a point, as you know, that with this 20 kilometers to go, and the only thing you want to do is stop, and you only know the only thing you can't do is stop. And when you get through that, you realize, okay, I've got the endurance. I'm proud of myself for what I did. And I think that was one of the defining moments in my life, was my first Comrades Marathon. And I ran it a perfect race for me as a novice, a recreational athlete. And I can live on that for the rest of my life. Whatever else I did, that was unbelievable. And it's interesting because my family couldn't understand, because I was very intellectual and I did well in scholastic work, medical student, blah, blah, blah. But I said that was the greatest thing I did. It wasn't getting into medical school and graduating as a doctor and becoming a scientist. It was running the Comrades Marathon and not quitting, keeping the same pace the whole way through. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Comrades Marathon, they do it a reverse way every year, right?
That's right.
Oh, okay.
It's
and have you done both?
People often ask which is worse, and I was a much better downhill runner, for whatever reason.
Okay.
My muscles were better controlling the eccentric loading. So if you go down, you've got the last 40 Ks start to go down, and particularly the last 20 kilometers. And if your muscles are not able to cope with that eccentric loading, you're in real trouble. And that's why near the end, the winners can drop minutes. My great friend who won the race in which I ran well, he was from my university, first university student. He was lying fifth with 5 miles to go, and he won the race. Because he's always said, but you can always make up 3 minutes in the last mile. And that's what he did. And it was interesting because he also was a mountaineer and he climbed a lot, and he did a lot of that type of loading. So that's, I'm not sure how we got onto him, but he inspired me. Yeah, he came through at the end. That's the key.
Well, Professor Tim Noakes, thank you. Thank you for talking with me today. Thank you for sharing.
Pleasure. It was really enjoyable, and you got the best out of me.